supposed to be doing. But what happens when that weakens? What happens when those things begin to wane that once maybe, I think at one point in time, all of us, right, we are extremely vibrant and excited and engaged and ready to go and pursue every challenge that is ahead of us. And then there's some days when it's not there, right? And maybe those stretches carry on for weeks or months or, maybe it goes for years, right? But what do we do when we are confronted with difficulties like that? What are we called to do? And so that's what the song asks us. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul kind of addresses a situation like this. And he talks about in chapter 12, he talks about, he kind of has this funny description in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He starts out where he's referring to himself, but he does it kind of like the old common phrase, hey, I know a guy that saw these things, that was taken up into heaven, whether it was in spirit or his body, or he doesn't know, God only knows. But he kind of he talks about himself in the third person and talks about how, a remarkable event that he experienced that he could easily boast in, right? But he says later on in the verses that, I'm not going to boast in that. In fact, when we jump into verse 7, it says, so to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. So I'm going to tell you how I initially had this all screwed up for a long time, and maybe it was just lack of, reading in depth enough. I didn't have good, reading comprehension, I guess. For a while, I thought God gave Paul the thorn in the flesh. And I think almost so much it was referenced in such a way that I just believed, like, oh yeah, well, God gave him this so he wouldn't become too proud or too conceited or too boastful or to get too big of a head. And then you realize when you read it, who does it say the thorn in the flesh was from? Who is it a messenger of? It's a messenger of Satan to harass me, right? And so I remember reading that, I was like, that's weird, because I always thought it was God kind of helping keep Paul in check, not let him get, leaning out over his skis or anything like that. But it says the thorn of flesh was given a messenger of Satan to harass me, right? But how does he start off this passage, right? So he's talking about a strong weakness, right? A thing that he is going to continue to have, something that, we know the interaction with him and God, and God says, no, I'm not going to take this from you. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So we know Paul's going to have this. And so this persistent weakness, this chronic struggle that he is going to have going forward, right? And I think for most of us, when we think about ourselves growing weakness, while there are times I believe it's just a unique set of circumstances, I feel like a lot of times it is the continual struggles that we suffer that are unique to us, that we are quite familiar with, whether it's, a certain temptation I consistently have, if it's just the circumstances that I am kind of generally going to be in, and I just am sometimes bogged down by the weight and struggles and stress of those situations. It's usually something I would say consistently we are fighting against, that draws us, drains us of our energy and weakens us, right? I wouldn't say I look back and say, yeah, it's been 1,500 different things that's really tried to drain my energy from Christ. It's generally a consistent set of struggles that are, I might have in common with some people, but my list is unique to me. You have a list that is unique to you, and we might have some things that overlap, right? But Paul here has something that is draining him, right? And while he is talking about boasting and things like that in this passage, and he talks about how he will boast in Christ because of this, the truth is he didn't go to God asking to have this removed because it's so nice and it really makes him better because of it, right? Like, and the same thing with us, right? Even though we look at this a little bit of a 10,000 foot view and be like, well, this was good for Paul, and we got to take ourselves down to the ground level for a second and be like, well, he's praying for this to be removed because he's struggling with it, right? And I'm guessing every day wasn't just him waking up and being like, I'm boastful, but also this thorn in the flesh is keeping me in check. So it's a perfect balance every single day, right? But no less, this is a story about Paul's weaknesses. And when the difficulty arises and he goes to God and he prays, right? He prays 3 times with the Lord about this, right? But God says, no. He says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I wanted to start off with this section here before we kind of jump from it for a moment. So Paul's thorn in the flesh, the uniqueness and the interesting way in which Paul writes this chapter, right? And I mentioned how I was often confused into thinking that God had given him this thorn in the flesh, almost like it was going to be a struggle, but God knew this would be good for him. Is the way in which he writes, so that I would not become conceited, right? And he phrases it almost as if God has given it to him, right? Like almost in that phrasing, you think it's going to be, God gave me this to keep me from this, right? Because do any of us in here think that Satan gave Paul this thorn in the flesh because he was worried that Paul was going to become too proud and too boastful? Is that why Satan gave him this thorn in the flesh, was to keep him humble? No, right? Satan didn't give him that. And we don't know exactly what this thorn in the flesh might have been. It could have been some sort of physical difficulty. It could have been a temptation he had or whatever. But Satan didn't give it to him to keep him from becoming too conceited. And in fact, he wants only bad things for us. He only gives us these difficulties to cause us to fall away from God, not to draw closer to him. But the main passage, the main part of this that I want to kind of draw out this evening is the fact that God wants us to use these moments. So what do I do when my love for Christ grows weak? Is I turn closer to him, right? And I know that sounds so like, okay, yeah, obviously, like, whatever. Like, it's easy to say that now. But notice how Paul's mindset is here. It was as if Satan has no longer a role in this. He's given me this thorn in the flesh, but now what's it being used for? How does he view it? Not as this enduring struggle that he's going to hate for the rest of his days, but he has now transferred that motivation that Satan had and turned it into a good motivation that God can be grateful that Paul is following along with, to show that he is not going to be overtaken by his boastfulness, by his arrogance, or anything like that. And perhaps that in and of itself was a daily difficulty, right? To see the things that Paul has seen, the revelations that were given to him, to know the things that he was given, and to see people try and kill him, to hate him, to throw stones at him, to do all the things that are going to be done to him. And he's seen such great things. And you're telling me this guy has to live the life that he does day in and day out and keep it all under wraps. Right? So he had difficulty, no doubt, which is why he prays to God to remove it, but it keeps him in check. And he uses this so that it is no longer Satan's thorn in the flesh, but now it is God's gift to me to avoid falling into sin, right? He has taken something wicked, the intentions of Satan, and he has drawn out the good value that God can draw from our weaknesses, right? And really that is what we are meant to see, right? The Bible does not begin to tell us, nowhere does it start showing us that over the course of biblical stories and things like that, people generally get much better. Did you know that? Like, did anybody see that progression through the story of the Bible where it's like, man, humans are so much better now as we get to the end of the Bible. They were pretty bad at the beginning, but man, they're really good now, and they used to be a lot worse. We've really evolved as a group of people, right? And I think nowadays we'd see the same thing, right? We've got technological advances, but I'd still say we've got a lot of weaknesses. And so it's a unique story here of how Paul transforms his mindset. And so we also are called to do that. So what do we do for when my love for Christ grows weak? Well, Paul's telling us we transform our mindset from looking at it simply as the intentions of what Satan has for us, and instead look at it for what God can use it for. But kind of jumping to a different character for a second, who does it tell us in the song we are actually supposed to look to? What are we supposed to draw our eyes to when our love for Christ grows weak? Right? Is it God and Christ? Is it then up in heaven on the throne, standing in all power and authority and glory, being subjected to them? Like it's not that scene in the song, right? We draw our eyes instead to Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I don't want to tell the songwriter that it's a strange place to pick, but I think most of us would agree if you were picking the low point of Jesus' existence, right? You might say the Garden of Gethsemane was his weakest moment, right? And yet it says, hey, when my love for Christ grows weak, when for deeper faith I seek, then in thought I go to thee, Garden of Gethsemane. Right? Well, what happens in the garden? And you might see some parallels here, but if you jumped over to, I guess the Luke passage is pretty good, but Matthew is kind of where I looked at. We don't have to jump over there, but if you want to skim back there, Matthew 26, 39 through 44, we have the interaction with Jesus and his apostles, and he's out in the garden, and he goes back and forth from praying to his apostles, and he continues to say, hey, stay up, pray with me, stay up, pray with me, right? Speaking of the parallels, does anybody know, how many times does he go back and pray? Just a guess. 3 times, right? And like Paul, was he praying, God, like, this is all good, like, we're doing good here, everything's fine, right? No, he's praying each time he goes, he says, if you can, let the cup pass from me, right? Like Paul saying, hey, please remove this thorn in the flesh. Paul and Jesus are praying the same thing here. Jesus is the cup of wrath that was due for all of us. Paul's is just simply for himself, but it's still the same. I don't want to have to bear this burden. Please remove this from me. And both times, right, they hold on to the affliction, right? Both times, while praying to God, the cup does not pass from them. Paul has a little bit lower stakes, right? It spares him, engaging in boastfulness and becoming too conceited. Jesus Christ had just the small stakes of, the salvation of every living being that has ever been and ever will be, right? So a little bit higher stakes in Jesus' situation. But it's interesting, the songwriter is telling us, we look at that scene, right? And it's not because it's Jesus standing triumphant perfectly without any difficulty or struggle or any sort of form of difficulty, but it is in fact his most difficult moment, right? His most incredible struggle and suffering is there in the garden, right? But Luke 22, if you read Luke 22, it's a very simple phrase there. It says, and being in agony, you know what he did? He prayed more earnestly, right? In being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. When we are in struggle, when we are suffering and using I try not to use the word agony a lot. I don't think I've been in agony many times in my life, right? Not like Jesus was in the garden with all the stress and the difficulty and the wrath that was going to be poured out on him and the horrible things that are about to come, right? But he's in agony, and what does that draw him to? It draws him closer to God. It says in those moments he prayed even more earnestly. He drew closer to God in moments of agony. What does Paul's thorn in the flesh draw him to? It draws him closer to God. All right, we live in cultures nowadays, and it's been like this for a long time, survival of the fittest and all that stuff, where weakness is something that has to be drowned out. It has to be expelled, right? And in fact, it's the opposite for us. We should not think of it that way. And jumping back with me, if you would, into 2 Corinthians, kind of as we start wrapping all things together here, when it says, God says, hey, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Right? We talked about Jesus this morning. He was made perfect through the things that he suffered, right? He had to endure those things to become that perfect sacrifice for us. And not in the way that he was without sin, because he could have gone to the cross, died, and he would have been sinless and perfect. But he endured all those things to be a perfect sacrifice for us, to become a perfect high priest for us, right? We talked about that this morning. Us as Christians, us as followers of Christ, right? I don't understand the need for Christ until I know the need I have within myself. The struggles, the inadequacies, the imperfections, the weakness I have is when I understand the things that I need, right? I remember the first time I had an apartment, and there are so many little things you don't know you need until you have a place of your own. You don't understand how important a duster is until you see so much dust, you're like, oh my. It's just things you don't think about, right? Simple stuff like that, my mother would tell me about. It's like, well, you need, broom, vacuum, trash cans, like things like that. I'm not even thinking of these things. Such simple things, but I don't know it until I'm in need of it, right? And sometimes we can avoid, having to go through great suffering and great need if we have other people who have already endured it for us to help teach us beforehand, right? Which is what parents are good for, to help us avoid paths that they've already trodden, right? But we have Paul's example here leading him not into, looking at his thorn as, some easy thing to overcome now, but instead he takes it to mean something good. And what ultimately it leads to, what ultimately it is meant to show is not even just the limited, application of him not becoming too boastful or him becoming conceited, but it in fact shows him the true power and necessity of God's power, right? That is what the importance of the thorn in the flesh was to him, is by him being subjected and limited and showing his own weakness day in and day out with the things that he struggles with, he would never forget the absolute need and desire he had for God's grace, for God's mercy, for God's power, right? The same things for us. When we endure the sufferings of daily life and of sin that people try to engage us with, or sin that people enact on us, we need those moments to continue to remind us of how much we need God, right? I am not self-sufficient. I am not self-adequate in who I am right now. I can't do this alone. And God gives us these reminders, right? Not by his own choosing. He's not going out there and saying, boom, illness, boom, suffering. He doesn't do that, right? God did not bring those things into the world. We did with our sin. Sin brought the thorns. Sin brought the sweat of the brow. Sin is what brought pain in childbirth. Sin brought those things. We brought that about, and Satan brought that about ultimately and tempted us to engaging with it, right? But now what? Okay, we have those things. Now we see the true need of God. And really, if we look all the way back to the garden, why did they choose to turn away from God? Right? Because Satan tempted them, saying, you'll see, you'll understand, you won't need God because you'll be like God. You'll be as he is. You'll know the things that he knows. Right? And ultimately, the sinful pursuits are for us to become that, right? Is to become our own God. Self-sufficient, self-satisfying, whatever. All about self. But Paul's mission is to be reminded about how much he is actually in need of God. And the opposite mindset he has of, I don't rejoice in my self-sufficiency, but in my utter dependence on God. The fact that I can't do it alone makes me boast, because then I see truly the great might of God, right? Because his power is made perfect in weakness. His great plan of salvation is made perfect by the fact of how he has enacted it, and it has survived throughout every generation since he promised it to Abraham. Through all these imperfect people, his will becomes accomplished, ultimately in Jesus, but his plan becomes fulfilled. We see his perfection in the fact that he can use imperfect people to ultimately accomplish his perfect plan, right? The church itself is a group of people with absolute tons of weaknesses, right? If you're shocked about anybody having weaknesses in here, don't be. We all do, right? But we're striving for this perfect idea that God has for us of his church, which is grounded in Jesus Christ as the cornerstone. But we are imperfect people striving for a perfect goal, right? And we are reminded how much we need God on a daily basis when we continue to see how we fall short. Our difficulties, our inadequacies, our limitations are reminders of that. And while the world wants that, I shouldn't say the world, Satan wants that to deter you from pursuing God, right? God's just reminding you how inadequate you are, how you screw up, how you're not good enough, and he's not going to give you the things that you want. But instead, we rejoice in those things, right? We rejoice in that change of mindset that recognize I can't do it alone and I need God. And that, not tying everything back to this morning's lesson, but that only comes when we truly understand that moment of Jesus Christ, his sacrifice, his gift to us, and how that changes us internally from being about being about us to being about him, right? That's the only way that happens. That's the only way this mindset can take place. Because if I'm still the core and foundation of myself, then I can't look at my punishments and difficulties as positive things that I can turn for good. Like I'm never going to think that way if it's all about me, right? But Paul here with his thorn in the flesh, Christ in the garden, those moments draw them closer to God. Paul turning and boasting in the power of God, Jesus turning and praying even more earnestly, growing closer to God. Yet not as I will, but thy will be done. Right? Those moments occur in moments of great struggle. Our moments of true understanding of God's strength and power and mercy come in our weakest moments. I appreciate the grace of God, not when I feel like I've been the most righteous and the most clean, but in fact when I have sinned the greatest, when I have been confronted with the greatest amount of shame. Do I truly understand what it means to be forgiven and to be counted redeemed in the fold of God? That's the moment I am reminded of the need of God's power. So wrapping this up, right, that phrase, God's power is made perfect in weakness, right? Like a lot of things in this Christian faith are paradoxes, right? It just doesn't make sense, but it's God using us, strengthening us, and reminding us who he is. Not using this as a reminder of keeping us down, but a matter of using it to lift us up, right? He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. That's Isaiah 40, verse 29, right? God is using his power to lift us up, to strengthen us, to encourage us, to remind us of who he is, of his ability, but also of his plan to save us, to not leave us in our weaknesses, but to show us how we overcome them, how we make them into an ultimate strength. And that strength is in turning to God, right? Does anybody in here play euchre? Does anybody? If you don't, shame on you, and we'll say a prayer at the end for you. There's a great feeling in euchre when you have the high trump card, you have the right, and you're just holding on to it, and you see either your partner's kind of worried about like, oh, I don't know if we're going to get the point, or you see the opponents you have that false hope of like, I think we're going to euchre them. I think we're going to get these guys, and then you play the right, and you just like it's an all powerful feeling, right? It's so good. It's such a good feeling, and everybody in here knows exactly what I'm saying, and I hope some of you are like, does anybody want to get together for euchre later? So, that's what God's strength is. It's the ultimate trump card but it's not me, right? It's not me doing it. I'm not the trump card. He is, right? He's the one that I can still turn to, though, right? the comfort isn't looking inward and self-saving, but it's in turning to God and knowing he will, he has, and he always will. And so, I think kind of a last Bible story that really makes it perfect is one of my favorites in Genesis 50 with Joseph, right? You just have this long story where the whole time, like, it's really hard for me to sometimes take it to like ground level where I'm experiencing the story as it comes. But, because you see, oh, God's getting him out of that. Right? But in the moment, that's horrible stuff happening to Joseph, right? Like, he's going to prison, right? He's being, thrown into slavery. He's, being forgotten by the guy who he just saved his life. He forgets him and, literally just goes on about his, like, these are horrible things that are happening. But when Joseph gets to the end, right, he says it kind of similar to how Paul does, right? When he's talking to his brothers and he said, hey, basically don't be afraid of me. He's like, you meant all those things for evil, right? And I love this phrase. It's one of my favorites. You meant it for evil, right? Satan meant the thorn in the flesh for evil. Joseph's brothers meant it for evil. They meant him to die. They meant for him to whatever, for him never to be seen again, for him to never have an impact on their life, right? God took that and made it good. But if you don't think all throughout that, while we don't have it directly written down for us, I don't need it directly written down to know Joseph had some bad days. He had some struggles, some real moments of weakness. And yet God used that to deliver him through. So that who was Joseph? Even when he got all the power in the world, essentially, he became the right hand of the most powerful man on the planet, who was Pharaoh at that time, the most powerful empire in the world at that time. And yet Joseph did not change because he remembered who he was at the weakest moments, when he had no one else literally in the world besides God with him. He remembers that. That's what our weaknesses can do for us. When you have absolutely no one else, you have God. And that's something to boast in. Because we talked about it this morning. Everybody wants someone there with them in their corner when everything else is away. No matter what, this person is with me. And this person isn't just anybody. It's the God of the universe. It's the all-powerful. It's the almighty. The one who was, who is, and who always will be. Right? There's nothing more comforting than that. And so we boast in our weaknesses. Right? When I am weak, then I am strong. Is because of God, is because of the strength of God. And we see that with Paul, we see that with Joseph, we see that ultimately in Jesus Christ. And I've used this, I know I've lied left and right here. This last illustration, I promise, this is done. I'm spent. Do you guys remember when I did the talk about Israel and I came here and I did the presentation? There was something I talked about during that presentation. We went and saw an olive press. Right? And you go to Gethsemane, it means olives, right? What they do with olive presses in that culture is they churn it out, like the press over the olive 3 times. The first, is the virgin olive oil, the best of the best. And right, and each time it kind of becomes for lesser and lesser jobs, right? But the idea is it is pressed for all it's worth, right? Paul goes to God 3 times, right? And we see 3 many times throughout the Bible, but he goes and asks for the removal of the thorn in the flesh 3 times. Jesus, in the garden, being pressed out literally, drops of blood coming out of him, is being pressed out to the greatest extent, right, that anyone has ever been pressed. And he is pouring everything into this, right? In the same way, we are called to pour everything out. And when we are pressed out, our weaknesses are exposed, our limitations, our difficulties, and yet we are not left discarded and worthless, but instead we are lifted up. So while, yes, weaknesses are a scary thing to be exposed, and we're afraid of those moments, I think we worry about those moments. The fact is, we should be prepared to be pressed out to the utmost. We should be prepared to be utterly spent in the cause of Christ. And I don't think nowadays it's as likely that it's going to be us being killed and made a martyr or anything like that. But we no less are called to expend everything we have for the cause of Christ. And that is still going to expose our weaknesses, but we have the strength of God carrying us beyond those, so that when we are weak, then we are strong. So that's all I have this morning. I think this morning and this evening. I thank you all for your attention. I appreciate every time I get to come and be here. You renew my enthusiasm in God's word. I am so encouraged by all of you. I hope you know that. And I'm so grateful to get to know each and every one of you as I continue to hopefully keep coming back here. I think it's been like 6-7 years now. That's insane. That's crazy. But I am so thankful for all of you, and hopefully we are in strong places spiritually right now. But if you aren't, we have a time now to pray for one another, to support one another, to lean upon one another, for we are all weak. But in the church, in Christ Jesus, we are strong. So whatever your needs are, please make them known as we stand and sing this song together.